I would like to welcome everybody to the PSC Colloquium. It's a great pleasure for me today to welcome back Kristen Harknett. Kristen is a professor in social and behavioral sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. She's also a research affiliate of the Population Studies Center, and we're not going to let her go. She has been a fantastic faculty member at Penn before. Kristen's research broadly focuses on family demography, including issues of marriage and fertility. More recently, her work has focused on the implications of the transformation of work on health and well-being. She is the founder and principal investigator of the SHIFT project, and I don't want to tell you too much about it because she's going to present the details of the project, but I just want to say that it's one of the probably the most innovative and creative contributions to the social sciences today that has brought new light on things that were difficult to investigate before. Kristen is one of the few people out there who has managed how to take advantage of these new platforms such as Facebook and Instagram to actually collect data from employees themselves, and on issues of work schedule, employment stability, and connections with health and well-being. Her work has appeared in the most prestigious journals in sociology, including ASR, Social Forces, and Social Problems, and has received many outside sources of support, including NIH, the Gates Foundation, and Russell Sage. Let me just say that the methodology is also being extended to other areas, and you see it being applied to study issues of migration and population displacement, which she's actually providing a framework that we can all take advantage of. So please help me welcome Kristen.
Thank you so much, Emilio, for that kind introduction. It's fantastic to be back. I'm feeling the feels now. I have not presented to human beings in more than 18 months, and I can't imagine a better setting for breaking the ice. So thanks so much to Emilio for the invitation, and to Don Ryan for setting up a really great itinerary. It's really fantastic to see so many old friends here. And I'm pleased today to have an opportunity to share some findings from the SHIFT project, which is a joint venture with Danny Schneider at Harvard University. We started this in the before times back in 2016. And so today I'm going to begin just by telling you what the SHIFT project is all about and describing our non-traditional approach to data collection. And then I'll present two of our use cases, one that exploits a company change and the other a legislative change. And then I'll end by previewing some of the future directions for the project. But before I get started, I did want to welcome you to interrupt at any point with questions. I don't mind being interrupted along the way. The SHIFT project focuses on working conditions in the service sector. The service sector is a really fascinating site to study for a lot of reasons, and I'll share just a few. The service sector is large. It employs almost 20% of U.S. workers. And these are not just jobs for teenagers. 3/4 of service sector workers are 25 years of age or older, and 1/3 of service sector's workers are working parents. And service sector jobs are often what we think of as the quintessential bad jobs. They're characterized by low wages, few fringe benefits. Many service sector workers are working part-time but would prefer to have more hours. Many of their schedules are erratic, as I'll talk about, and their earnings are volatile. And all of this is a recipe for economic insecurity. In our SHIFT project surveys before the pandemic struck, we found that around 1/4 of service sector workers reported hunger hardship in the prior year, difficulty paying their bills in the prior month, and over 40% of these workers said they thought they'd be unable to cope with a $400 expense shock right on the brink of a gigantic health and economic shock the next year. And there's been a lot of terrific research on the changing nature of work broadly. And the service sector is in many ways ground zero for a lot of these changes. So there's been discussion of the great risk shift. And for service sector workers, that means that they bear more of the risk of the uncertainties of business fluctuations, of ups and downs in consumer demand. So if business is slow, a service sector worker might get sent home early, or their shift might be canceled and they're sent home with no pay. So for service sector workers, pay and hours are not guaranteed. The rise of the 24/7 economy means that service sector workers often have to keep their schedules open and available for work at virtually any time and are unable to protect time for family or themselves. Many employers take an algorithmic approach to work scheduling where they try to very closely align staffing with demand to minimize labor costs. And this means that workers are subject to just-in-time scheduling, where their schedules are assigned on short notice with little input from the workers themselves. And many of the conditions that make service sector jobs bad jobs are not well captured in our existing data sources. And so in order to get a more complete picture of working conditions for these workers, and also to be able to characterize conditions at particular companies or in particular geographic locations, the SHIFT project set out to collect our own data. And that's what we've been up to for the last few years. So the SHIFT project data collection involves a large national survey database, a lot of repeat cross-sections from workers who are paid by the hour and employed in the service sector. We also do some strategic oversampling of particular geographic locations. And a unique feature of the data is that all of the workers we survey are nested within named large companies, so we can compare and contrast company practices. So where do we find large samples of service sector workers at named companies? Well, the secret is the Facebook targeted ad system. So the Facebook targeted advertising infrastructure is mostly used by businesses to sell you things. And so if you're active on social media, Facebook or Instagram, you may see targeted ads to sell you shoes or other things. But you can also harness this same infrastructure to recruit survey respondents, and that's exactly how we use it. So shown here, one of the targeting options is by employer name. So we are able to post ads to workers employed at Home Depot or at Lowe's or at Best Buy. And we design the ads to appeal to workers at a particular workplace. We try to match the uniform. And so this is a sample ad from the SHIFT project to a worker employed at Domino's. And we ask the worker to take a short survey, tell us about your job, and we offer a lottery incentive. If that worker clicks on this ad, then they're taken outside of Facebook or Instagram to our Qualtrics survey. There's a digital consent, and then hopefully they complete the survey. The survey can be taken on a mobile phone or a tablet or PC, and it collects a lot of information about work conditions and also some information about worker demographics, economic security, health, and if they're a parent, about parenting and child well-being. We include more details about the data collection approach and some of the steps we've taken to validate the data in an article published a couple years ago in Sociological Methods and Research, and I'll share some highlights from that before getting into some of the findings. To give you a concrete sense of who we're talking about when I turn to the results, some logos and some company names are shown here. But we've amassed a very large database, it's 140,000 survey responses and counting, from workers at around 140 large companies. spanning the food service sector, retail apparel, and these other categories that you can see here. And we've been at this for a while now. We started back in fall 2016. We've done repeat cross-sections twice a year ever since. We're in our 11th wave right now. We're collecting, we've collected 2 waves in 2021. We've got some geographic oversamples, and we've got some embedded panel data where we follow up with workers over time. And you may be thinking, this is a unconventional way to recruit survey respondents, and you may have a healthy skepticism about the quality of data that yields. And so I want to first sort of reinforce that skepticism and then hopefully take some steps to allay it. So the first thing that you would be right to worry about is the response rate using a method like this is not great. So we do well in the scheme of things. Like for a Facebook advertiser, we're doing really well and compared to other research examples. So we get 5% of users clicking on our ad, but only 20% of them fill out our survey. So in the end, we're getting responses from only 1% of the people who've been advertised to. To put this in context, Pew has published that response rates to telephone surveys now have plateaued around 9%. So we're even worse than that, but this is a problem more broadly and not just for us. And we do take some steps to try to ensure data quality in some respects where we include an attention filter and we throw out responses if people speed through the survey, and we have some ways of filtering out bots. But I'll just briefly touch on some of the ways that we've thought through the potential biases that could threaten our conclusions from an approach like this, and the way that we've reassured ourselves that we can kind of go forward and use that information.
No, just going back to the...
Yeah.
5.3% of what? That's you said that's the users of what? Where do you get the population?
So if we target an ad to Home Depot workers, Facebook reports the metrics to the advertisers. So they tell us 5%, and we download all this. This is part of our database, is we know how many clicks we got for each ad. And we were able to try to optimize by doing some A/B testing in the early days to try to do our best at getting...
So Facebook gives you the number of Home Depot users.
Yep.
Okay, you get the total from Facebook. Okay. And
yeah.
you know, okay.
Yeah. And the click-through rate comes directly from the ad manager in Facebook. So the set of things that we worried about were non-coverage of our sampling frame, response bias on observed characteristics and unobservables, and then also how would this stack up against probability samples. So first, on the sampling frame, it's not perfect. There is a digital divide. Not everybody is on Facebook. But if we look at some statistics from Pew, about 80% of the prime working age population is active on Facebook. So we don't want to discount that there's some non-coverage, but it's not massive. We do have bias on observed characteristics. We do get disproportionate responses from women and from white workers. That's fairly easy to address. We have the tools to do that using post-stratification and weighting. So we construct our own survey weights, aligning the demographic characteristics of our sample with the American Community Survey. So we can adjust for the fact that we have some demographic skews in the data. Another adjustment we make, there's a ground truth database of an employer database called Reference USA. So we can also sort of right-size the employers to match their share in the industry. So we're making sure we have the right amount of Walmart and Target and Costco. And weights are mechanical. They work how they're supposed to work, and when we apply the weights, then our worker characteristics align with the American Community Survey. The bigger and the thornier problem is, what if our 1% response rate means that there's bias on unobservables? And maybe we're only going to get the really disgruntled workers who want to complain, or we'll have some other bias like that creeping in. So this is something we worried a lot about in the early days, and we thought, what are we really worried about here? Well, disgruntled workers was one thing, and then we tried to specify what we were worried about. And then we designed a test, and it's not a perfect test, but it gives us some information. So what we did was, we tried to maximize the bias to see if it would make a difference to our bottom line. And we tried to maximize the bias by recruiting pairs of samples. So we said, are you proud to work at Target? Take our survey and tell us about it. Are you disrespected at your job at Target? Take a survey, tell us about it. And then we had these two paired samples. And then we could look at the things we cared about, like what's the relationship between schedule instability and psychological distress. And we found reassuring results that in these paired samples, the core relationships that we wanted to estimate were similar. The last thing, one of the other things that we did was benchmark against probability samples. And we went out and collected our own data because there was a lot of stuff we wanted to learn about that wasn't in the CPS or the NLSY. But there is some overlap on things like hourly wages and job tenure. So we took what overlapped between our sample and these probability samples, and then we just compared. And those results were quite reassuring. So here we're looking at the relationship between job tenure and hourly wages, and we find that the shift project data, and we've got multiple lines here trying out different weighting approaches, falls right in between the CPS and the NLSY. So we were closer to either of those two data sources than they were to one another. Finally, even if we still are not convinced, like these are non-probability samples, you might not be getting the exact right hourly wage or the exact right percent part-time, we can still rely on research design to net out some remaining biases. And so in the use cases that I'll share with you in a moment, that's exactly what we do. We use comparative research design. So even if our levels might be a little bit off, our hope is that our comparisons are still going to be valid comparisons. So before I get into use case number one, I'll pause and see any questions. Okay, super. All right, so the first use case, the SHIFT project was initially all about work schedules, and I will talk about work schedules, but then the pandemic struck, and no one cared about work schedules anymore. People cared about PPE and paid sick leave, and so I'll talk about paid sick leave. So although we were doing a lot of work on work schedules, we also had collected information on whether or not workers had access to paid sick leave on the brink of the pandemic. And so really early days, like back in the beginning of 2020, we pulled data from our previous surveys to estimate what share of workers at large companies didn't have paid sick leave, because we'd be pretty worried about that with a pandemic coming. And we found that overall, 53% of our survey respondents did not have paid sick leave. And so this was an editorial piece in the New York Times that drew on our data showing, holy cow, we're about to be going into like a major health crisis, and look at all these workers that don't have paid sick leave. In response to the pandemic, at the federal level, there was action taken to mandate paid sick leave. But unfortunately, large employers were exempted. So all of the employers in our data set weren't covered by this requirement. And even for those who did benefit from this expansion, it was temporary and it has since ended. Another avenue, though a little more piecemeal for spurring company action is public pressure, naming and shaming. And so there was one company that in particular was called out early in the pandemic by an investigative journalist named Judd Legum. And he told horror stories of Olive Garden workers coming to work and their coworkers are sick and this is a catastrophe. Olive Garden looked terrible and immediately announced, good news, we're offering paid sick leave to our workers. And this was a golden opportunity for the Shift Project because we've been collecting data from large named employers since 2017. And Olive Garden is one of those large named employers. So this was an opportunity to take advantage of a natural experiment. And so we published an article earlier this year using this Olive Garden natural experiment. Companies don't always follow through on the changes that they announce. In this case, Olive Garden did follow through and we're able to see this huge spike in paid sick leave, which I'll show you in this slide. So here we use our comparative research design. So even if maybe we're not exactly right on the level of paid sick leave coverage, we hope that we're right on the comparison. And what we see is that food service employers in our data set that are not Olive Garden experience very little change in paid sick leave coverage between 2017 and fall of 2020. But this bluish-greenish line representing Olive Garden, you see this enormous discontinuity where naming and shaming happens here and then paid sick leave coverage increases by 50 percentage points. Enormous, right? And so we're able to take it then one step further and say, does paid sick leave make a difference to workers coming to work sick? And so that's the next step of the analysis here, where we see the pandemic is associated with a decline in working sick overall, but a bigger decline for Olive Garden workers who've just experienced this huge boost in access to paid sick leave. And then closing the loop, after we published this article, Judd Legum, the investigative journalist who set these wheels in motion, took a victory lap and said that investigative journalism has actually resulted in real change. So that's use case number one. Yeah, John.
What was the actual policy change? Like, how much sick leave did they?
Oh, how much do they offer?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Even in so I know generally in our data, very, very, very few workers who have paid sick leave have enough to matter during a pandemic. Usually they're accruing like a few hours of sick leave per month. Very few have like 2 weeks of sick leave. And I don't recall what Olive Garden offered. But it's a good question when you're interpreting that presenteeism result.
Extra bread did they have to sell?
Yeah, how many extra breadsticks, right? Indeed. Any other questions before I move to next case study?
A question about the timing when you were asking about when they went in. The reference period was around the time stimulus checks also hit.
Around the time stimulus checks hit?
Was it the time also when the PPE came into picture?
Yeah, so lots of things were happening. And so in the comparative design, yeah, stimulus checks could be affecting the overall trend, but that's one of the benefits of having this comparative design. Because if part of getting to stay home, even if you don't have paid sick leave, is you have a stimulus check to make up for the lost wages, that might be part of the overall downward trend here. Any other questions? So the other research example I'll share has to do with secure schedules. And this was really one of the major motivations for the Shift project back in the day, pre-pandemic times. And before COVID-19 struck, service sector workers dealt with a great deal of schedule unpredictability and instability. About 2/3 of workers have less than 2 weeks notice of when and how much they're going to work. A quarter of workers work on-call shifts where basically you don't know until day before or morning of whether you're actually working or not. 2/3 say that their shifts get moved around by their employer at the last minute. And so there's a great deal of churn routinely in workers' schedules before the pandemic. Now, people started to take notice of this a few years back. There was this New York Times article that got a lot of attention about a Starbucks worker, Jeanette Navarro, had this crazy schedule that made her life, wreaked havoc on her and her young son. And in response to the growing appreciation that these work schedules were causing major problems for workers and families, some localities passed Fair Work Week legislation. I'll talk about our evaluation of Seattle's Fair Work Week law, but Philadelphia is among the handful of cities that has one of these laws. And so down in the lower left corner, your council person, Helen Jim, is celebrating the passage of Fair Work Week here. The Seattle law and the ones like it are designed to rein in this unpredictability that service sector workers routinely face. And some of the key stipulations are that workers need to have 2 weeks advance notice of their schedule. Or if you need them to work on short notice, you need to pay them extra for that inconvenience. If you've scheduled them but then you cancel their shift, they get half of the pay for that shift. So it's just trying to restore some of the balance of where workers aren't assuming all the risk of the uncertainty of business fluctuations. It's more shared. There's also a provision that if you have closely spaced shifts, like you've closed the store and then you've got to come back and open the store, you also get paid extra for that. And so the intended effects of an ordinance like this, it's called the Secure Scheduling Ordinance. The intended effects are to reduce schedules assigned on short notice, timing changes, reduce changes that are made without any pay, reduce on-call shifts and cancellations and what get called clopening shifts, closing then opening. And so we look at all of this in our evaluation and then also a summative scale that puts all these instability conditions together. We also might imagine that if schedules become more predictable and more stable, workers might be better off. There might be downstream effects on well-being, so we also look for those. And just last week, we published these results in this article that I'll summarize for you. So unlike the Olive Garden example, which kind of fell in our lap and we were sitting on a lot of data, the Seattle example, we took more of a proactive approach. The law was passed in 2016. We knew we wanted to study it. So we did a strategic oversample in Seattle. So we advertised a lot to Seattle workers because we really wanted to build up a big enough Seattle sample that we could do a robust evaluation. So before the law took effect in the spring of 2017, we get a baseline snapshot of conditions in Seattle and a bunch of comparison cities. Then 1 year later and 2 years later, we go back and see how things are looking and whether anything has changed. Our sample inclusion criteria, workers had to be paid by the hour, employed in retail or food service, and work for a large employer because that's who was covered by this law. And your workplace had to be in Seattle city limits or in a designated comparison city. We collected surveys from 700 some Seattle workers at baseline in year 1 and 400 some Seattle workers in year 2, and then a bunch of comparison city workers. The comparison cities were chosen to be aligned on labor environment. So Seattle is a fairly progressive city. They have a minimum wage ordinance. And so we chose other cities that also have minimum wage ordinances. We also restricted to large metro areas that had at least 1 million people. And so this map shows you where our comparison cities were. We also used 4 other comparison group definitions for robustness, but I'll just show you these results here. We estimate the difference that the law had for Seattle workers using a difference in differences research design, where we're looking at the change over time for Seattle workers, comparing that to the change over time for comparison workers, and then the difference is our estimated impact of the law. And we find that the law did move the needle on work schedules. So to orient you for a second, what we're looking at here, baseline year 1, year 2, the green line represents Seattle, and the gray line represents comparison cities. And baseline is 0, so we're plotting here changes over time. So if you start with the less than 2 weeks notice, in some ways this was the most clear-cut black and white provision of the ordinance, the easiest one to comply with, I would say. And we see that over time, the share of workers in comparison cities getting less than 2 weeks notice is flat. It stays the same because nothing changed for them. But in Seattle, we see a 10 percentage point decline in schedules assigned on short notice. We see the same kind of pattern where things moved in the expected direction, not always like enormously so, but across these 6 indicators. And then at the top, that's that scale that puts it all together. And so the scale changes very little in comparison cities, but the unpredictability declines for Seattle workers. So this was the hoped for and the intended effect of the law. And then we turn to a set of well-being outcomes. And we do find some evidence that the law had downstream effects and improved not just schedule conditions, but also quality of life measures for workers. So here, if we look at the sleep example, not much change in comparison cities, but an improvement in sleep quality for Seattle workers. We look at material hardship, which is a scale of things like hunger or housing hardship. And we see that that declined for Seattle workers and stayed about the same for comparison city workers. Psychological distress didn't change, and we saw a small improvement in happiness. Yeah, John.
When did Seattle change its minimum wage law?
It was a couple of years before
So this is over.
Fair Work Week.
So this came after the minimum wage law change?
Yep. Yeah, and generally the pattern is the cities that pass living wage or minimum wage ordinances, once that's done and in the bag, those same kind of coalitions tend to then say, okay, now let's tackle schedules. So in the article, we also use the scheduling law as an instrumental variable. And in a first stage, we use the law as an exogenous instrument to predict schedule unpredictability. And then in the second stage, we take that predicted value of schedule unpredictability as a predictor of a well-being outcome. And the idea here is now we've tried to purge unpredictability of the endogeneity that would naturally be all tangled up with it, and then see, is there a causal relationship between schedule unpredictability and well-being outcomes? And the instrument works pretty well in the first stage, and we find the expected relationships, that when you experience more schedule unpredictability, you're less happy, worse sleep, and more material hardship. We then take these estimates and do a simulation. And we say, all right, this is what things look like in the world we observe. workers tend to have about 3 out of 6 types of unpredictability. And here's their level of happiness, sleep quality, and hardship. Now, what if we imagine the utopian scenario where we make all unpredictability go away with our magic wand? And the model estimates suggest that there'd be really huge well-being benefits to doing so, like a huge increase in happiness and sleep quality and huge declines in hardship. So where things stand on secure scheduling, I think we have pretty strong evidence that the Seattle law moved the needle on work schedules, improved some well-being outcomes that we would care about from a quality of life perspective. And we have some evidence, some causal estimates that schedule predictability does affect people's well-being. And I think this is important because there's a lot of attention paid to wages. Like, we've got to raise the minimum wage, it's not enough. But for hourly workers, it's not just how much you make per hour, but how many hours you work and when they're scheduled and whether you have any control or notice of that. That matters a lot for well-being. There are some implementation findings that another team recently published. And so a cautionary note here is implementing a law like this is hard. It was a big lift to educate workers and employers about what these changes meant and what it meant, what they had to do to comply. And it's pretty hard to investigate and enforce when employers weren't complying. So those kind of cautionary notes are contained here. Broader scheduling landscape, similar laws on the books in a handful of cities, but these conversations kind of stalled out when the pandemic struck. I think they're just starting to be resuscitated. And there's a federal Schedules That Work Act that's going to be reintroduced just next month. And a couple of states are starting to talk about schedules again. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over my epilogue, which is that nothing's changed for workers during the pandemic, even though there's this narrative of frontline service sector workers being heroes, still providing groceries and our pharmacy needs and all of that. But nothing's changed. Schedules are still as bad as they've ever been in the service sector. So future directions for the SHIFT project. We're going to keep doing what we do. We are planning to collect more data for the next few years. And the research directions include continuing to inform Fair Workweek policymaking. We have some reports coming out in the state of Colorado and Michigan to sort of inform their conversations, and a report coming out around the time the Schedules That Work Act is reintroduced. We'll keep looking out for opportunities to do these company natural experiments. We are going to continue to try to fill gaps in the data on job quality. In the past, we focused a lot on schedules, paid sick leave. We've done some workplace health and safety stuff during the pandemic. But we also have some information on whether workers get a break or not during a long shift. Lean staffing, where you really can't take a break. And sort of what's happening on the job and the intensification of job demands. We've got some plans to look at gender and race ethnic inequalities in work conditions. We're trying to mine our data as best we can to address the issues of the day, COVID unemployment, for instance, and how that's affected worker health. And then some big plans that we had in motion before the pandemic struck had to do with really kind of getting a better handle on workplace automation and surveillance. And that's what we were like really gearing up to do 2 years ago. But then we kind of took a detour because of COVID. But this will come back. I'm hoping someday we'll be beyond the pandemic. And that's one of the things on our agenda. So I'll end by thanking many collaborators, team members, and funders. And thank you so much. It's really just been a delight to get to be back and present to you.
Let me just say that, for the graduate students, Kristen was mentioning to me that one of the things that she misses from Penn the most is the interaction with graduate students. So, I think there's an opportunity here. I'm doing the advertisement for you. But.
No, absolutely. Yeah, so if this piques interest, please do be in touch. Okay,
Yeah.
It was a tie, Emilio and John.
Or
Or
Jason.
Jason, sorry.
Yeah, this is excellent. It's really excellent. It's really provocative. One thing service workers do is interact with customers, and those interactions have almost certainly been changing over time too, and they've gotten more fraught. Is part of your data collection enterprise to look at how they're being treated by customers at Starbucks, the speed with which they produce their espressos, the quality of their espressos,
Yeah.
and kind of service?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So I think some of the questions that we've designed on the future of work and how the nature of work is changing get at these leaderboards. Like, do you have a leaderboard where you know exactly where you rank in terms of the speed? There is also, increasingly there are these little customer surveys and you get rated. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to fold in. We don't yet have direct measures of whether you feel respected by customers. We do have a new module about bullying and respect, but I don't know if customers are in there or not. But it's a really good question. The way we've kind of leaned into the changing conditions of the pandemic, we do ask about things like online ordering and feelings of safety. But I really like the idea that's kind of been a blind spot. We haven't asked directly about customers being more appreciative or more abusive. You could imagine a bifurcated situation.
No, this is fascinating. I wanted to ask you about what you learned about COVID, and there's all these news reports about workers not going back to work, and when you look at the data carefully, it's not very clear who's not going back to work, and it's not very clear. It's really very low skill who can afford to not go back to work. I don't. Do you? Have you thought about investigating that? Do you have any insights into what's happening with that sector after COVID?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question and a really prominent concern right now is the work disincentives of the child tax credit and stimulus payments and all the rest. We are looking at unemployment, and we do see that the generosity of UI back in the spring of 2020 really went a long way towards sustaining workers. But then it became a lot less generous in the fall, and we see the toll that took, where the unemployed workers are not doing great. So I don't have any grand proclamations about this worker shortage debate. I will say that the conditions that workers face are really hard to sustain in terms of the lack of notice and unpredictability. We've done a lot of work about the fallout from that, how you sometimes have to leave your kids unattended, or there's just all sorts of ways that these jobs are, you can't even believe someone could still, and there is a lot of turnover for precisely that reason. At the same time, workers can't afford to not work, and so interestingly in our data, we don't see the same big gender difference in hours reduction or in leaving the workforce that you see in other sectors. And I think that's just because they're just so at a financial cliff. They don't have any really room to maneuver.
With your survey, can you get at middle managers in some of these companies? Because I could imagine that the labor shortage, which is real, a lot of companies can't find people, would actually lead to scheduling being more stable because you have the limited supply of workers. And then I guess my other question was, have you looked at middle management's happiness with these laws? Because I can imagine it's a pain to schedule people, and if you don't have a lot of flexibility, then your job at Starbucks becomes that much harder as a manager.
Yeah, oh, there's so much to your question, so many different directions I could go. So middle managers, we have some information, but it's not really from the perspective of how hard is your job, or, you know, so I don't know how much I can address your manager question. I will say that we can contrast, one of the benefits of our data is we can contrast across companies. And you definitely can trace the line between the more stable scheduling conditions and better job, like higher job satisfaction and things like that. So I think there definitely is a business case for making these job conditions a little bit more manageable for the workers, because then the workers are more happy and less exhausted, and so there's a way in which that's good for a company bottom line. From the logistical standpoint, these are all large companies, and they're mostly using Chronos and Dayforce and algorithmic scheduling anyway. And if you're doing it by an algorithm and you're just optimizing pennies of your labor costs, then you're going to end up with what we see in most of these places. It's not hard to change the algorithm and have the default be publish your schedules 2 weeks in advance. They know their projected demand, based on all these inputs. They've got a ton of data on it. So I feel like that isn't really the reason. And I think it is more like partly a choice on the part of some of these employers, and they have these labor budgets and they have to stay within the labor budgets, but maybe if the middle managers had more latitude, that would solve it.
Yeah, so throw out the algorithms and let managers actually manage their staff.
Well, I don't know, but I don't know. Yeah, algorithms are only garbage in, garbage out, right? But there are a couple of companies, Deputy is one, Homebase is another, who are trying to take a high road approach to algorithmic scheduling and nudge employers to publish schedules sooner and things like that. So part of the problem, part of the solution maybe.
So you're mentioning a lot of sort of corporate and also so the firm level and the industry level difference in that answer. And so I was wondering if certain firms stand out as being really egregious. Are the grocery stores better than apparel stores because their demand is more predictable? Do you see any kind of either individual companies that stand? Is Whole Foods better than Giant or?
So both. You do see patterns by industry and you do see variation within industry. Both are interesting. The across industry stuff is maybe more explicable by the type of business model they need to have. But I think maybe even more interesting is the variation within. Competitors make very, very different choices. And so an example that often gets shared is Costco makes really different decisions than Walmart. But even Walmart isn't that bad in the scheme of things. Dollar General, they're terrible. That really defines the floor. And then in grocery, Trader Joe's is really pretty good. So Trader Joe's shoppers, you can be a little more self-satisfied about it. But there's a lot of variation. And then fast food, In-N-Out's pretty good, even though fast food tends to be the pits. Frank.
Yeah, your wonderful evidence shows changes, fairly substantial changes. Are they equally shared by males and females, old and young, relatively better off from education? Is it pretty smooth across within the population, or are there interactions?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So with the Seattle data, we're somewhat limited in being able to make those comparisons just because it was hard to build a big enough sample to even show the overall effects. We were hoping that we'd have 50% bigger samples, and we really had to pull out all the stops to get where we got. Now that we have data for New York and Oregon, and Philly and Chicago we can fold in, I think in the future we can bundle all the cities that that have passed very similar laws, and then that'll give us the ability to stratify in the way you're suggesting. I think those are great questions.
So I just had this idea when you were looking at Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's famously is very, very selective in the kinds of workers that they hire. They do a lot of weird personality test type stuff.
Yeah.
Are you able to pick up on this using the named employers aspects of the data? Like that there's a different kind of worker who works at Walmart versus Costco from the employer selection side? And of course Trader Joe's, if you know anything about it.
Yeah, it's a good question. At one point, and this is a graduate student project idea, but at one point we were scraping job ads to try to get at some of those differences in what are different companies looking for and saying in their job ads. I don't think we ever got that done. I think you're right that there probably are all sorts of different selection mechanisms that might affect the composition of workers at these different places. So that should certainly be part of the interpretation.
Yeah, the issue with job ads is that that's like the first cut.
Yeah.
And then once you're in the door, there's a bunch of other personality quizzes. Like years ago, I worked at Target and I had to do like a personality quiz about my life.
There's probably a lot of knowledge collectively in the room. Like a lot of people have had a job at some point in retail or food service, and so these reports are useful. But yeah, I think it would be really neat at some point to pair, in the early days, we did a qualitative study to just try to inform what we were going to do in our survey. Like we wanted to be just more grounded. And I sort of feel like we're due for another dose of that, because there's only so much you can learn from the closed-ended survey questions. We've tried to split the difference a little by having a few open-ended questions embedded to get a little bit more of that serendipitous discovery. But if anyone wants to partner on a qualitative paired study, let me know. Okay.
I assume employers have been strongly opposing these sorts of ordinances. Do you know if any of them have tried to make the case that their profits vary between the cities that have such an ordinance and those that do not?
I don't know that they've made that case. And many employers are opposed. And in Seattle, the Restaurant Association was super active in opposing it. They sent letters questioning the credibility of the research team that was doing the manager interviews. And so there has been some strenuous opposition. There are exceptions. In Philadelphia, I believe La Colombe was quite supportive of this ordinance. In New York, Starbucks actually was supportive of their Fair Work Week ordinance. So I think some companies have seen the writing on the wall and said we want to be seen as the good actors here. But the other response is there's a really important study done by Susan Lambert and Joan Williams partnering with the Gap, where they showed that when the Gap changed their practices in a set of test stores to make schedules more stable, that it actually improved business outcomes, that those stores sold more than the ones that had the workers with the still topsy-turvy schedules. So that's what it.
Thanks so much for this talk. I was very inspired by the ability of your data to sort of respond to these policy changes. I have a methodological question. I thought I noticed a mention of embedded panel data.
Yeah.
I imagine that a lot of workers in your sample are sort of moving in and out of different jobs across these employers. Have you been able to follow people longitudinally? And do you have any interesting findings from that?
Yeah, we have so far deployed our embedded panels just selectively for a couple of papers to try to more robustly estimate relationships like between schedules and hardship. And in a paper we've got in the pipeline now, looking at the health effects of unemployment. We use some of the panel data in that. But like you said, there's a ton of turnover. And so it's really a moving target. Like if you follow people for a long time, they get sometimes very far away from the retail and food service jobs where they began. So I would say there's probably a lot more to come from our panel data. We've sort of figured out how to do it. We're actively collecting more of it, but so far we haven't fully integrated it into all of our findings because the sample sizes are more limited there too, but it's just, there's that trade-off.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. I apologize, I have two unrelated questions.
Yeah.
So one is picking up on this firm level variation. I was wondering if you had a chance to maybe combine your data with some kind of firm level data set like CompuStat or something like that.
Yeah.
And if anything interesting has come out of that. And then the second question is, and this is not unique to your data collection, but what do we know, if anything, about the accuracy of self-reports of workers' conditions? I mean, compared to either the official policy or legislation, and are there gaps in knowledge or anything like that?
Yeah. Okay, so on the first question, for a very long time we've had on the to-do list writing the paper about what features of company ownership affect the choices about practices. So we have done some merging and we just haven't gotten around to getting that all the way to fruition, but someday that will come. On your question about self-reports, you just want to interpret what we've got as what it is. Like, these are workers' self-reports, and I think that a value added here is that a lot of times companies say they're doing something, but it doesn't exactly match the lived experience for the workers. One example of a sort of failed experiment, when we first started this project, Walmart announced they were going to offer stable, fixed schedules to their associates. And that was one of our primary motivations for getting this up and running, because we thought Walmart's huge. We can do the pre-post, and we can look at what difference this makes. Walmart didn't do anything. We've followed them for years, and they didn't do anything. They keep re-announcing the same change. Maybe someday they'll do it. But so there's a real value to asking workers, well, what is your experience? Because it doesn't always match what the companies are saying. And another example of that is companies might have paid leave on the books, but a worker might still feel pressure to come to work sick, even if they have that in writing.
We have time for one final question.
I just had a question about, so there are tons of strikes going on, mostly in the manufacturing industry, and I know you're collecting data pre and post major policy change, but I was wondering if you had considered taking a proxy for work organization or something like that to examine the difference between pre-contract negotiation and post, or is that not really a thing in the service industry?
So, are you talking about unionization?
Yeah.
I think we could, maybe, but its union density is super low in the service sector. It's not non-existent. There's some SEIU, some UFCW, but we haven't done any pre-post yet there. And if it's something where there's an opportunity that you know of, let me know, hit me up. Sometimes we get lucky, with Olive Garden, and we've got Amazon in there. So if something crazy happens at Amazon, we can look before or after. We're always kind of on the lookout for big things changing.
Okay, so we run out of time. Thanks,
All right, nice seeing you. Well, yeah, definitely catch up on perspective of life. Life is goes on.
Oh, okay. No, I meant to follow up with you. Oh, no, I was, right, I meant to follow up. I'm sort of basically, sometimes I forget. Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Over there.
I'm really sorry. contact you, and I'm so much excited.
I might be
If in fact the business.
Facebook is, so,
urging me to leave early.
Yeah.
Snapchat.
Snapchat, not Facebook.
Oh my gosh,
That was the
that's fascinating. I'm so
So many coalescent work.
Well, yeah,
I
maybe
wonder,
they take them off.
I wonder who would be missing.
fire.
It's the same way that I am pulling the tables.
Yeah.
I'm having dinner with
Analytical, so this is his
Oh, I mean, I think,
some of the work that is doing on,
This is such great
you know, what do you think is gonna happen?
We're about the same.
Thank you.
Companies coming back, are you doing some research on which office spaces or?
No, absolutely. I mean, the things about these companies is that because they're service companies.
They can, but I think more general,
More
no.
generally, I think we're going to be opening
Trying to
companies
figure
that have
out
more of an
if
ethic
stores
model,
are.
where the people who do the office
Okay.
space will be
You know that I
necessarily
no
have
problem.
dedicated offices. They'll have desks, they'll have-
That's actually a friend of mine who works for
Good.
this.
Yeah, how about you? You live
No, but I
I
was
was
listening
I
to
was
this famous
organization in New
song.
York City.
Then I
They
was
just
thinking
got a
maybe
new
there is something,
executive,
and then in the minute
and
I
she told
found.
me that he is planning to change the company working so that they do exactly that. They reducing the.
It's so nice to see you.
They
You know
reducing the footprint, you know.
Well, good to
office
reestablish
spaces,
contact with
and
everyone.
including like she's their CEO or something.
Hi.
People in the company. She's not gonna have her own office anymore. She has to sign up for that. And you know, she's like me, older person, so she was like, where am I gonna keep my files? I have to move everything online.
That's right.
And you know, I don't like,
Have been
you know,
then
I
related
am reading all the
because
time.
we
I
saw
didn't know.
You know, it's
And
just like
I've
that.
often thought
I would
that
have my
that
own
would be
office.
a nice
But
solution.
I think, but it's
probably have too many
interesting
irons in
how,
the fire as
you know,
it
this
is,
is
but if somebody were interested in
that is what you said. It's
taking on that part, I
Get
just
rid
feel
of
like
individual
so many of the same
Go in and
questions
sign
that
up.
were
Yes.
And at the same time, maybe having people work 2 days a week.
Oh, exactly, I mean, you're not gonna.
Have them work 1 or 2 days from home. People might join co-working spaces. Companies might partner with co-working spaces. to
So
have-
that people who have small apartments can work at home all the time.
That's right, but so New York City,
Yeah, they approached
can't work
us
in small,
maybe 2
Well, like
years
she
ago,
lives in New York, right?
and they
Yeah,
are
but
actually
big, but
very
that's-
high road in
Now, a lot more.
wages, pretty
How are you gonna organize
schedules.
your office at home?
Workers don't have a lot of
Right, I mean,
control.
I have a big house, so I can have.
So they wanted to get
but
better.
Doesn't have like an extra
Okay,
bedroom.
department
The office left,
provided
but
design
Oh,
and
yeah.
dimension. So we're doing that with IKEA now.
you know.
And so I do think that there's a lot of
it's a huge big
value
I
to
think
finding
companies
these
are
kinds
gonna be
of
doing
partnerships.
override.
And then
If you see it gone. And so again, this is sort of
want to
this
see it,
hybrid
'cause I mean,
model
if it works the
where
way
we're
that
spending a
you
couple of days at home, spend a couple of days in the office, and then spending.
And another friend who is
These
high up on
organizations-
HR, so she's in a